the midst of this series called God Has a Name. We're diving into the verse that Ramola just read. It's basically God speaking out his own name, Yahweh, Yahweh, compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, and the rest. What we learned over the past few weeks was how God gets to define who God is, and we don't get to define who God is. God gets to decide what is good and bad. We don't get to define what is good and bad. And we saw in the next week why God has a name. It means that He's personal, He's a person. We get to directly address a person, not an energy, not a force, but a person. And then we saw that He's compassionate and gracious, which means that He feels for us and He acts towards that feeling that He has. And then we saw that He is slow to anger, which means He has huge nostrils, which means He breathes in through His nose when He is angry, which means He's calm. And it takes a lot to get God angry, but if He gets angry, it's because He hates injustice, He hates evil, He hates anything that is not good. And we saw how we are called to be like that. We are called to make His characteristics known by being compassionate and gracious, by being slow to anger. And today we're going to look at how He is faithful in a long direction, faithful for a long period of time. That's something we're going to dive in today. Just some context before we get into that. If you didn't know this, we live in an age that is called the age of instant gratification. Okay, we've got Swiggy for unlimited options on food. We've got Uber and Rapido and Ola for unlimited options on vehicles. We've got Tinder for unlimited options on weirdos. We've got Netflix for unlimited options on movies and TV shows. And this has spread on to our work where it takes less than a month for us to figure out if we want to stay in a place or not. And then we have the option to move constantly. Now, none of these things, except for maybe Tinder, none of these things are necessarily horrible. Okay? They are good gifts in a way that we get to praise God for and we get to use them. The problem is when we start applying these principles in our relationships, where we can jump from a friendship to another friendship just because it starts getting inconvenient and uncomfortable. What we're here to talk about today is something called long obedience in the same direction in an age of instant gratification. That's it. That's the message. So if you came here for a one-line message, that's it. You can get back on Instagram now. For the rest of us who actually want to know what long obedience is, it's going to be a long sermon. Okay, it's not. I was kidding. Calm down. Let's just get back into the verse. The part that we're in today is abounding in love and faithfulness. That comes right after slow to anger. In Hebrew, that is hesed and emet. Okay, let's just split that apart. Hesed, H-E-S-E-D. There's no real way to, there's no English equivalent for this word. How it's translated is generally unfailing love, steadfast love, or covenant loyalty. It's a covenant term, and we'll get back to what that means. Remember this word covenant because we need to understand it later. Emet, or faithfulness, can also mean truth, or it's the word where we get amen from. It's got this sense of reliability around it, which means God is reliable. God will never, ever, ever let you down, unlike a lot of us. Okay, listen, if you didn't know this about me, especially if you're not an LML member, I hate it when people say they'll do something and they don't do it. Like the idea of letting someone down because sometimes it gets inconvenient and uncomfortable. God is nothing like that. I am one of them who does something and doesn't follow through. But God is nothing like that. God says He will do it and He will do it. He never lets His people down. He is faithful. That is emet. So when hesed and emet come together, the result is astounding. It is abounding in love and faithfulness. Let me say that again. When Hesed and Emet come together, the result is astounding. It's abounding in love and faithfulness. Let's try that again. When Hesed and Emet come together, it is astounding. Be astounded. Okay. Okay, I'll tell you the problem here. The problem here is with the English language. Because we read love and faithfulness and we say we've heard it all before. We did compassionate and gracious, sounds pretty much the same. Love, how much will God love? There's an issue here because not necessarily the same thing. We make it the same thing in our English language, but in Hebrew it's entirely different. It's Rahum vi Hanun, and then it's Hesed and Emet. Okay, we'll see what exactly it means. It means that God will never abandon his people no matter what the cost. That's what it means, abounding in love and faithfulness. We see this in Psalm 89 and a lot of Psalms actually. Psalm 89 says, I will sing of Yahweh's great love forever. With my mouth, I will make your faithfulness known through all generations. I will declare that your love stands firm forever, that you have established your faithfulness in heaven itself. That pairing of love and faithfulness is repeated over and over again. Okay. I have this new shirt, if you've seen it, it says cool, cool, cool. You guys seen it? Okay. But when you read it, how do you read it? Right? Yeah. We all read it as cool, 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 cool. Why? Because we know where it comes from, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Okay. There's this thing going on in Brooklyn, on Comedy Central. It's an ad for, I think, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, where they're counting the number of cool, cool said. And the number is around 184 or something like that throughout the show. Okay. This pairing of love and faithfulness, just in the Psalms, 126 times. It's a major theme in the Bible. You see it over and over and over again. Love, faithfulness, love and faithfulness. Hesed, Emet together. Okay, we'll see how it plays out in one of the stories in the Bible. Let's just go back to that word we spoke about. What's the word? Covenant. We look at covenant because to understand love and faithfulness, we need to understand what covenant means. Okay, so covenant is a word from another time and another place. Nobody says covenant anymore, if you've realized. So in the ancient world, people who entered into a covenant would make a promise and then they would sign a legal contract. It's relational, but it's also legal. It's friendship, but there are consequences to breaking a covenant. That's what a covenant means. The closest thing we have today to covenant is us playing tag. I'm kidding. Shouldn't have agreed to that. The closest thing we have to covenant is actually marriage. Do you promise so and so? I do. Do you promise so and so? I do. You see love and faithfulness in marriage. When you get married, you sign your life away. That's a covenant. Well, but you get the idea. Yeah. Your life isn't necessarily your own anymore because you have to stay faithful to your spouse, and it's a binding contract in a way. That's covenant. So if you know the Bible, you'll realize that it's got a lot to do with Yahweh making covenants with his people. One of these places is Genesis 12, where the world is in a mess, and Yahweh calls this random dude named Abram, changes his name to Abraham, and decides that he will save the world through Abraham. And the first thing he does is he makes a covenant with Abraham. Okay, so check this out. Here's the covenant. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. A lot of bless there. But okay, so check this out. What God says first is he will bless Abraham. He says, I will bless you, which means he will bless Abraham and his family first. Then all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. You see that pattern? God blesses Abraham, Abraham blesses people. God, Abraham, people. In a way that we understand it, God, the people of God, the world. That's how the order of blessings flow. Okay, but here's something we need to really understand what the promise is, that God is going to put everything right for the entire world through Abraham. The promise is not that Abraham will be fully happy or that he'll be healthy. Abraham's biggest problem at this point of time is that he doesn't have a baby. So here's God saying, I will make a huge generation out of you, and you expect plop a baby to come and say, here you go, have fun. Right? That's God answering promises. And yet that's not what happens here. Often in life, what's going to happen is the promises of God, we look at the promises of God and we see our circumstances and they just don't match up. And we say God is unfaithful because he hasn't kept his promise. Make sense? Sounds familiar? Right? But the promise was never for Abraham to be completely happy or rich. He was rich, but that wasn't the promise. So problem is Abraham doesn't have a kid, and time passes by, and he's like really old at this time. And him and his wife are super old, like think older than Emmanuel and Ramola. Okay? And still no baby. You would think Abraham would give up on the promises of God. Sorry, dude. But then comes Genesis 15, and here's a warning. It's going to get weird. Animal lovers, please cover your ears. So here's what happens. Yahweh comes to Abraham and says, make a sacrifice. So Abraham takes a bull, a ram, a goat, and some birds, and he cuts them in half. And he places the half in a line, kind of like a picnic, and then they sit together, they have some Coke, and none of that happens. But they do cut animals in half and they place them along lines. It's really super weird, and we should ask why that happens, because we don't understand what happens because we live now, but back then it was quite normal. So when people entered into a covenant, what they did was they would cut up animals, place them in two halves, and then they would walk through that path, like just for fun. But of course, there was a reason behind it. It was them signifying that their covenant was sealed, and both of them saying, if I don't keep my end of the bargain, let this happen to me. Blood and death. Okay? It gets weirder. So what happens right after this is Abraham has cut his animals, and Yahweh makes him sleep. Probably in the midst of all that. In the midst of the halves of animals. So Abraham is fallen asleep, and he sees this dream or a vision where God, Yahweh, is in the form of a smoking fire pot walking through the animals. All by himself. This is Yahweh's way of saying, I will keep my end of the bargain, even if you don't, even if your descendants don't. No matter what the cost. And if blood is to be spilled, it won't come from Abraham, it'll come from Yahweh. Hopefully at this point your mind has gone straight to the cross. Right? But you need to realize where this all started. Way back in Genesis 12. When God promised Abraham, and God faithfully kept that promise. Yahweh is willing to die and become like these animals to keep his promise. And the rest of the Old Testament is just Yahweh faithfully keeping that promise over and over again, and Israel failing miserably. But even in that mess, Yahweh constantly responds to them, constantly hears their prayers, and works to make evil turn for good. We see this years later in the book of Nehemiah when Israel is in exile, and Nehemiah is basically quoting the verse that we're on, Exodus 34. You are a forgiving God, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love. Therefore you did not desert them. Now therefore our God, the great God, mighty and awesome, who keeps his covenant of love, do not let this hardship seem trifling in your eyes. In all that has happened to us, you have remained righteous. You have acted faithfully while we acted wickedly. Nehemiah recognizes that even in exile, God has not abandoned them, and he knows that Yahweh will keep his promise. Except his prayer doesn't get fully answered, because for that answer, we have to wait for Jesus. And when it comes to Jesus, when Jesus comes into the scene, hopefully by now, when I say Jesus, what you should be thinking about is Yahweh in flesh and blood. If you're not thinking about Yahweh in flesh and blood, we need to do the series all over again. But Jesus is Yahweh in flesh and blood. But here's another thing. He is also Israel in flesh and blood. He's the descendant of Abraham, through whom the world is going to be saved. Remember the promise? God, Abraham, his people. God, the descendant of Abraham, his people will be blessed. So what Jesus does is he takes all our failings, when Adam failed to keep his covenant, when Abraham failed to keep his covenant, when Israel failed to keep their covenant, when you and I fail to keep our promises, Jesus absorbs it all, drags it to the cross by his death, defeats it, and then by his resurrection gets victory for us. When Jesus, Yahweh, is abounding in love and faithfulness, and we can look forward to a world set free from death. This was Yahweh's promise to Israel, and Israel's story is our story. Because we fail all the time, right? We fail to keep our promises, and God has always been faithful. So Paul says this to Timothy in his letter. He says, if we are faithless, he is still faithful because he cannot disown himself. According to Paul, faithfulness is the very nature of God. It's just not possible for him to be unfaithful, even if we are. He's always going to show up. He's always going to be faithful. He's faithful even when we are not. Okay, now here's the important thing. There are times when it will not feel that way, just like Abraham. Okay, I gave a praise report last time saying I got a job. Yesterday I found out it's for 30 days. How is God faithful? How is God faithful when I find out that one of my family members is dying? How is God faithful when I'm struggling financially? How is God faithful when I'm sick and I keep falling sick all the time? How is God faithful when I don't find the right person that I need to marry? How is God faithful when nothing seems to be going right? We ask these questions and we ask, if God is faithful, why do I cry all the time and why am I upset? But remember the covenant. The promise was never, ever for us to be happy all the time. It was never that everything would go right on this side of heaven. Remember the promise. The promise was blessing to Abraham and his people, and from us and through us, the world will be blessed. And the world would be brought to redemption. The promise was never for an easy life full of health and wealth. It was to bless the world. The problem is that we look at the circumstances in our life and we think God is unfaithful. But he really isn't. Right? In fact, Jesus made the opposite promise. What Jesus promised was, in this world you will have trouble. No other way. You will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And it's not that God doesn't want you to live a happy life or a healthy life or a rich life. He's a father. What kind of father wouldn't want that for their children? He's just not willing to give that to you at the cost of your soul. Right? He's willing to take you through the long route, disciplining you, so that it is your character and holiness that is so much more important than what this world has to offer. God is so much more concerned about long-term character than short-term happiness. And he's willing to sacrifice one for the other. That's our God. Troubles will come. And don't forget, we also spoke about the fact that there is evil in the world. Right? It's a very complicated process. And so our hope is not that bad things won't happen to us. Our hope is that Jesus has risen from the dead. Anything is possible. Right? Because the resurrection is this loudspeaker shouting, God is bigger than death. God is stronger than evil. God's promise is not that we will be healthy, wealthy, and happy all the time. The promise is that we will be blessed and we can turn around to bless others. God, Abraham, people. God, us, the world. And God will be faithful to that promise. And he'll never let that promise down. And not just this promise, there are promises that he whispers to you in your quiet times. There are promises that people speak over you. And if you know that is from God, just know that even if it doesn't line up with what your circumstances are, God is always faithful to keep that promise. And he will see that promise through. just before we close, we need to flip that whole thing of faithfulness also. Remember, because Yahweh is something, we need to be something too. So if Yahweh is faithful, are we? Are we faithful? Can we have long obedience and patience in the same direction in an age of instant gratification? Can we stay with something for years or even for decades? Can we give up shortcuts to life? Because the best things in life are the results of faithfulness. Think about your relationships, your friendships. Can you stay in them even when things get uncomfortable and inconvenient? That's faithfulness. Or your career, I don't know. I mean, that really depends on what God speaks to you in that moment, if you should stay or leave. But what about your church? Can you stay faithful there even when things seem to be going messy? Right? Okay, let's just stop for a moment and we just sang that song about if the stars were made to worship, so will I. If the mountains do their part, so will I. The oceans are faithful in what they are called to do. The wind blows where God sends it, and it is faithful where what God calls it to do. So just look at me for a moment. Think about it. Where has God called you to be faithful? What's the first thing that pops into your mind? Just think about it for a moment. And the odds are what you thought about is probably not going to be easy. It is going to be hard. It's going to be difficult, and it's going to involve hard work, pain, and frustration. But that's what the best things in life are made of. Be faithful like the God you worship.